China did not invent the bullet train. China did not invent the suspension bridge. China did not invent the skyscraper, the solar panel, the electric car, or the nuclear power plant. Every single one of those things was built somewhere else first, by someone else, years before China ever touched them. So here is the strange part. Open the record books today, and China holds almost every big number on the list. The longest bridges on Earth, the busiest ports on Earth, the most solar panels, the most electric cars, the most nuclear reactors being built right now, more than every other country on the planet added together. How does a country skip past inventing something and still end up owning the entire category? That is the real mystery here, and the answer is not just they copied it. The truth is stranger than that, bigger than that, and a whole lot faster than that. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at bridges, skylines, and power lines in a completely different way. We are going to walk through trains that outran their inventors, bridges that make your knees shake just watching them, cities that grew up almost overnight, and power plants so big you can see them from space. And right at the end, we are going to answer the one question that ties this whole thing together. Why does this keep happening over and over in almost every single field? And just so you know, this is not one of those videos that throws out a big number and moves on. Wait until you hear about the glass walkway with a floor built to sound like it is cracking under your feet on purpose, or the tower that went up faster than most people finish a bathroom renovation, or the power plant shaped like a giant cartoon animal that you can only really appreciate from an airplane window. This story gets stranger the deeper you go. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button right now. Here is a real reason to do it. This channel breaks down the biggest, strangest, and most jaw-dropping builds on the planet every single week. The kind of stuff that sounds made up until you see the numbers. Once you get to the glass bridge part of this video, you will understand exactly why you want to stick around for the next one too. All right, let's get into it. Bigger, faster, higher. Let's start with something almost everyone has heard of. The bullet train. Japan built the very first one back in 1964. It was called the Shinkansen, and it showed up right in time for the Tokyo Olympics. At the time, a train that could run at 200 kilometers an hour felt like something out of a movie. People from all over the world flew to Japan just to ride it. A few years later, France built its own version called the TGV, and it pushed the speed even higher, up to 300 kilometers an hour. For a couple of decades, that was basically it. A handful of countries had fast trains, and everyone else just watched from the sidelines. Then, in 2008, China opened its very first high-speed rail line. That might sound small, it was not. By 2024, China had built more than 45,000 kilometers of high-speed track. Just sit with that number for a second. If you added up every single country that runs high-speed trains today, Japan, France, Germany, Spain, South Korea, all of them combined, you would get somewhere around 20,000 kilometers. China built more than double that by itself in less time than it takes some cities to finish arguing about where to put a new bus stop. Japan, the country that actually invented the bullet train, has about 3,000 kilometers of high-speed track after 60 years of running it. China built 15 times that amount in about 15 years. The trains run at 350 kilometers an hour. They show up on time more than 95% of the trips, and they carry over 4 billion passengers a year. That is more people than the entire world's airlines carry in the same amount of time. Think about what that actually does to a country. A factory worker in one city can hop on a train and be at work in a completely different city in under 2 hours. A student can go to college in a city hundreds of kilometers from home and still make it back for dinner. Places that used to feel like different worlds are now basically next-door neighbors. Picture a normal Tuesday for someone using this system. They grab breakfast at home in the morning, walk to a station, and board a train that glides out of the city so smoothly they barely feel it start moving. 2 hours later, at 350 kilometers an hour, they step off in a completely different city hundreds of kilometers away, in time for a lunch meeting. Then they hop right back on and are home before dinner. That is not a special trip. For millions of people, that is just a normal day. The same way some of us might drive 20 minutes across town for a lunch meeting and think nothing of it. Now let's go from the ground to the sky, because bridges tell almost the exact same story. The suspension bridge, the kind held up by huge cables strung between two towers, is one of the most famous inventions in engineering history. Think of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco or the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. For most of the last 100 years, the biggest and longest suspension bridges in the world belonged to the United States, the United Kingdom, or Japan. Today, every single one of the 10 longest suspension bridges in the entire world is in China. Not most of them, not the majority, all 10. One of them, the Yangtze Bridge in the city of Wuhan, has a main section that stretches 1,700 meters between its towers. That is more than 500 meters longer than the Golden Gate Bridge, and it carries 6 lanes of highway traffic on top and 4 more lanes underneath. It was built in about 4 years. China also holds the record for the tallest bridge on the planet, a bridge in the mountains of Guizhou province called the Beipanjiang Bridge. The road deck sits about 565 meters above the valley floor underneath it. Stack the Eiffel Tower on top of itself almost twice, and you still would not quite reach the height that cars are driving across every single day. And then there is the part of this story that will actually make your stomach drop, the glass bridge. A see-through glass walkway strung high above the ground existed in a few small tourist spots around the world before China got involved. Then China looked at the idea and built more than 100 of them. The most famous one sits in a place called Zhangjiajie, in a part of China filled with tall stone cliffs that look like something from a fantasy movie. The bridge stretches 430 meters between 2 cliffs, and it hangs 300 meters above the valley floor. That is roughly the height of the Eiffel Tower, except instead of standing next to it, you are walking across it on a floor made entirely of glass. Every step you take, you can see straight down through the glass to the trees and rocks far below. Engineers will tell you the glass can hold the weight of dozens of people at once, and it is completely safe. Your legs will not believe them. Some of these bridges are even built to gently flex and creak while you walk, which sounds terrifying, and it is on purpose. Engineers found that a little bit of movement makes the experience feel scarier, which makes people talk about it more, which brings even more visitors. Over 2 million people a year choose to walk across bridges like this for fun. Some parks took the idea even further. A few glass bridges have hidden speakers and screens built right into the walkway. As you step across, a crack sound effect plays under your feet, and a spiderweb pattern flashes across the glass panel you are standing on, like it just gave out beneath you. Nothing actually breaks. It is a special effect. But by the time your brain catches up to that fact, you have already jumped about a foot in the air. That is not an accident. That is a park designer who understood exactly what makes people scream, laugh, and then immediately tell every single one of their friends about it. One more thing before we move on, because it connects everything above and below the ground. Tunnels. The machine that digs tunnels through solid rock, called a tunnel boring machine, was developed mainly by engineers in Switzerland and Germany. Switzerland used one to carve out the Gotthard Base Tunnel through the Alps, a project that took 17 years and became the longest railway tunnel on Earth when it opened in 2016. China looked at that machine and basically bought everyone it could get its hands on. Today, China runs more tunnel boring machines at the same time than the rest of the world combined. Entire mountain ranges that used to take a full day to drive around can now be crossed in minutes through tunnels blasted straight through the rock. One railway currently being built, called the Sichuan-Tibet Railway, has to cut through some of the highest and most dangerous mountains on the planet, climbing and dropping through elevation changes that would make most engineers in other countries choose a completely different route just to avoid the headache. When it is finished, a trip that used to take days on winding mountain roads will take a few hours instead. There is one more train story worth mentioning here, because it shows this same pattern in a slightly different way. Germany actually invented a technology called maglev, short for magnetic levitation, where a train floats just above the track using magnets instead of rolling on wheels. Germany built and tested the technology for years, but never actually opened a full-length maglev line for regular daily use. It stayed as more of an experiment. China took that same German technology, built a working line in Shanghai, and now runs the fastest commercial train on Earth, a maglev that can hit speeds of over 430 kilometers an hour. It gets passengers from Shanghai's airport into the city in about 8 minutes flat, a trip that would normally take close to an hour by car. The country that invented maglev never opened a real train line with it. The country that borrowed it did, and now runs it every single day. So that is trains, bridges, and tunnels. Impressive, sure, but it turns out that same speed and scale gets even wilder once you point it at whole cities. That is where things start to feel almost unreal. The cities that grew overnight. The skyscraper is an American invention. It started in Chicago in 1885 with a building called the Home Insurance Building. It was only 10 stories tall, which sounds tiny today, but back then it changed everything, because it was the first building held up by a steel frame instead of thick stone walls. From there, American cities kept building taller and taller, all the way up to the Empire State Building, and eventually the towers of the World Trade Center. In 1990, China barely had any skyscrapers at all, not a handful, almost none. Today, China has more skyscrapers than any other country on Earth, more than the United States, and more than all of Europe put together. There is a city called Shenzhen that most people outside of China had never heard of a few decades ago. It now has more super tall buildings than the entire United States does. 40 years ago, Shenzhen was mostly farmland and fishing villages, with a population smaller than most college towns. Today, it is home to more than 17 million people, packed with towers that did not exist when a lot of parents watching this video were kids. One of them, the Ping An Finance Center, stands taller than the Empire State Building by more than 200 meters, and it went up in a city that basically had to build its skyline from a blank sheet of paper. But the wildest part of this story is not how many buildings China built. It is how fast they built them. In 2012, a construction company built a 15-story building in just 6 days. 2 years later, the same company built a 57-story tower, complete with offices, hotel rooms, and apartments, in 19 days. Think about that. A building taller than most skyscrapers in your average city, finished in less time than it takes to binge-watch a season of your favorite show twice. Here is how they pulled it off. Instead of building everything piece by piece on site the normal way, they built almost every part of the tower inside a factory first. Walls, floors, wiring, plumbing, all of it made ahead of time, like giant building blocks. Then they trucked the pieces to the construction site and stacked them on top of each other, kind of like snapping together oversized Lego bricks at a rate of roughly 3 floors a day. Engineers who studied the finished building actually found that the factory-made pieces were just as strong, and in some cases stronger, than parts built the old-fashioned way, because a factory floor is easier to control than a windy, dusty construction site 50 stories up in the air. Today, China adds more skyscrapers to its skylines every single year than the rest of the world combined. It is not just office towers either. China built an entire brand new airport for its capital city, Beijing Daxing International Airport, and opened it in under 5 years from the day construction started. The main terminal is shaped like a giant starfish spreading out in 5 directions, and it was, for a while, the largest single airport terminal building ever constructed. Most countries spend close to that long just finishing the paperwork before an airport project can begin. Now, here is where the story turns from land to sea, because while cities were shooting up into the sky, something just as big was happening down at the docks. For most of the last century, the busiest port in the world was Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. If you wanted to know what a world-class shipping port looked like, that was the benchmark everyone pointed to. In 2004, a Chinese port called Shanghai passed Rotterdam and became the busiest port on Earth. Then another Chinese port passed Rotterdam too. Then another, and another. Today, 7 of the 10 busiest ports in the entire world are in China. 7 out of 10. Rotterdam is still a real busy port. It just is not the benchmark anymore. It has slipped well outside the top 10, passed by one Chinese port after another over the course of about 20 years. The port of Shanghai alone moves more than 47 million shipping containers every single year. That is more than double what the busiest port in the United States, the Port of Los Angeles, moves in the same amount of time. And most of these Chinese ports run with robotic cranes that load and unload massive ships without a single human hand ever touching a container. Trains run right up to the edge of the dock, so goods can move straight from a giant cargo ship onto a train car without ever sitting around waiting in a truck line. Back in 1990, China's ports were handling only a small slice of the world's shipping traffic. The equipment barely existed yet. In about 30 years, China built enough port infrastructure to take over 7 of the top 10 spots on the planet, all while building a massive manufacturing economy that actually needed all those ports in the first place. Some of these ports barely need people at all anymore. At the fully automated terminal in Shanghai, giant cranes guided by computers pick up shipping containers, stack them, and load them onto trucks that drive themselves around the yard, all without a driver behind the wheel or an operator in the crane cab. If you stood there watching it happen, you would see massive machinery moving constantly, and almost nobody around to run it by hand. If you took every shipping container that passes through Shanghai's port in a single year and lined them up end to end, they would stretch for thousands of kilometers, far enough to cross entire countries. And these are not old ports that slowly grew over 100 years either. Several of them were built up from small fishing docks into some of the busiest shipping hubs on Earth within a single working lifetime, which in the world of ports and harbors is almost unheard of. Trains, bridges, skyscrapers, and ports all have one thing in common. None of them work without a massive, constant supply of power behind the scenes. And that is exactly where this story goes next, straight into the race to control energy itself. Chasing the sun and splitting the atom. The solar panel, the flat panel that turns sunlight straight into electricity, was invented in the United States back in 1954 at a place called Bell Laboratories. For decades after that, solar power stayed expensive and rare. It sounded great in theory, clean energy pulled straight from the sun, but the cost kept it stuck as a small niche technology that governments had to pay extra money to support. Then China stepped in and did 2 things at the exact same time. First, it built factories that could churn out solar panels by the millions, which crashed the price down. Second, it started building solar farms so massive they could power entire regions by themselves. Today, China makes about 80 out of every 100 solar panels used anywhere in the world. Not most of them, 80%. Over the last 15 years, the cost of solar power has dropped by about 90%. And the biggest reason for that drop is simply that Chinese factories learned how to make panels cheaper and faster than anyone else. Out in Inner Mongolia sits the Tengger Desert Solar Park, a solar farm so large it covers more than 1,000 square kilometers of what used to be empty desert. That is bigger than some entire cities. It generates enough electricity to power millions of homes. China has even built floating solar farms, panels mounted on giant rafts that float on top of lakes and reservoirs, where the cool water underneath actually helps the panels work more efficiently. China has even turned some of these solar farms into a bit of a spectacle, the same way it did with the glass bridges. In a couple of spots, engineers arranged the dark and light-colored solar panels so that from above, the whole farm forms the shape of a giant panda. You cannot see it from the ground. you can only really appreciate it from an airplane window or a satellite photo. It still makes electricity exactly the same as any other solar farm. Somebody just decided that if you are already covering a huge stretch of land and panels, you might as well make it something people want to look at. The solar panel was an American idea. China turned it into the cheapest way to make electricity in human history. Now let's talk about cars, because this next part might surprise you the most. The modern electric car really took off thanks to an American company, Tesla, based out of California. For years, most of the car industry insisted that regular people would never actually want to drive an electric car. Tesla proved them wrong. China watched this happen, and then China moved. Today, China produces and sells more electric vehicles than every other country on Earth combined. More than the United States. More than all of Europe. More than Japan and South Korea put together. In 2023, roughly 1 out of every 3 cars sold in China was electric. There are now more than 800 different companies in China building electric vehicles, everything from tiny budget cars that cost less than a used sedan back home, all the way up to luxury models that go head-to-head with Tesla. A Chinese company called BYD, which actually started out making rechargeable batteries for cell phones back in 1995, briefly became the biggest electric vehicle maker on the entire planet by sales in 2023, even passing Tesla. And behind all of these cars sits an enormous charging network. China now has more public electric vehicle charging stations than every other country in the world combined, which means a driver can travel almost anywhere in the country and never be too far from a place to plug in. Solar is not the only place this happened either. Wind turbines, the giant spinning blades you see out in open fields or off the coast, follow a similar story. The modern wind turbine came out of research in Europe and the United States decades ago. Today, China builds and installs more wind turbines than any other country on Earth, including entire farms of turbines standing far out in the ocean, tall enough that their blades sweep through the sky higher than most skyscrapers are tall. Between the wind turbines and the solar panels, China now has more clean power capacity installed than the next several countries combined, all added in roughly the same stretch of time it took some other countries to finish planning a single wind farm. Some Chinese car companies even skipped the whole idea of plugging in and waiting. A company called NIO built stations where a driver pulls in, and instead of charging the battery, a machine underneath the car swaps the entire drained battery for a fully charged one, automatically in under 5 minutes. You pull in with an empty battery and pull out with a full one faster than it takes to fill up a regular gas tank and pay for it. All of this added up to something bigger than anyone expected. China recently passed both Japan and Germany to become the largest car exporter in the entire world, shipping millions of vehicles, a huge share of them electric, to countries all over the globe. A country that barely made cars people wanted to buy a couple of decades ago is now one that ships them everywhere. Tesla proved that people wanted an electric car. China proved that an entire country could run on them. All right, now let's talk about the biggest, most dramatic energy story of them all: nuclear power. Here's the simple version of how it works. Inside a nuclear plant, tiny particles get split apart, and that splitting releases a huge burst of heat. That heat boils water into steam, and the steam spins a giant turbine, which is really just a fancy fan hooked up to a generator that makes electricity. It sounds complicated, but at its core, it is really just a very intense way of boiling water to spin a fan. Nuclear power was born in the United States in the 1940s, growing out of the same research that eventually led to nuclear power plants generating electricity for entire cities. For a while, the United States led the world in nuclear energy, but then came a string of scary accidents. 3 Mile Island in the United States, Chernobyl, Fukushima in Japan. After each one, public trust in nuclear power took a hit, and across most of the Western world, building new nuclear plants basically became politically impossible. Germany shut down its entire nuclear program. The United States mostly stopped building new plants. China kept building. Right now, China has more nuclear power plants under construction than every other country on Earth combined. Not more than any single country. More than all of them added together. Roughly 25 new reactors being built at once. China's newest reactor designs even include safety systems that can shut a plant down completely on their own, without any outside power or a single person needing to step in, which specifically fixes the exact kind of failure that caused the Fukushima disaster in the first place. China is aiming to have around 150 nuclear reactors up and running by the mid-2030s. For comparison, the United States, the country that actually invented nuclear power, currently runs about 93 reactors, and that number has been slowly shrinking for years as old plants shut down without new ones replacing them. On top of that, Chinese construction crews have gotten fast enough that some new reactors go from breaking ground to producing electricity in around 5 to 6 years. In a lot of other countries, a single nuclear plant can spend that long just working through permits and safety reviews before a single wall gets poured. And then there is water power. The Hoover Dam in the United States proved that a river could be turned into a massive source of electricity. China took that same basic idea and built the Three Gorges Dam across the Yangtze River, the largest hydroelectric power station on the entire planet. It produces roughly 10 times more electricity than the Hoover Dam from a single structure, enough to help power tens of millions of homes at once. The lake it created behind the dam stretches back more than 600 kilometers, further than the distance between some entire countries, and it is big enough to spot from a satellite in space. Right next to the dam sits a giant ship elevator, basically a massive water-filled bathtub on rails that lifts entire boats 100 meters straight up into the air in about 40 minutes, so ships can ride an elevator over the dam instead of taking the long way around. So now you have seen trains, bridges, cities, ports, solar farms, electric cars, and nuclear plants all following the exact same pattern. But there is one more piece of this puzzle, and it is the one that quietly connects every single story we just covered. The signal that ties it all together, every single thing we just talked about, the trains, the ports, the factories building 57-story towers in 19 days. All of it eventually needs one more thing to truly run at full speed. A way for machines to talk to each other instantly. That is where 5G comes in. 5G, the fifth generation of wireless network technology, was not invented by any one country. It came out of years of work by companies in the United States, Europe, and South Korea working together, names like Qualcomm, Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung. When the technology was finally ready to roll out, most experts assumed it would take the better part of a decade for any country to build a full nationwide network. That is how these things normally go. Slow, expensive, one city at a time. China deployed more 5G towers in its first 2 years than the rest of the world managed in 5. By 2023, China had more than 3 million 5G towers up and running, which is over 80% of every 5G tower on the entire planet. Small farming towns that most countries would consider too tiny to bother connecting have full coverage. Factories run almost entirely by robots that talk to each other over instant 5G signals. In some hospitals, doctors now guide robotic surgery equipment from far away, using a connection so fast there is barely any delay at all. At major ports, self-driving trucks and robotic cranes coordinate with each other automatically, without a driver in sight. Even out in the countryside, some farms now use 5G-connected sensors and drones to check on crops and water levels across huge fields, without a single person having to walk the land. Even something as simple as traffic lights got wrapped into the network. In several major Chinese cities, traffic signals are now connected to cameras and sensors that read how many cars are backed up in real time and adjust the lights automatically, city block by city block, to keep traffic moving. No one sitting in a control room flipping switches. The system just watches, thinks, and reacts, thousands of times a minute across an entire city at once. Put all of that together and you start to see the pattern. It is the trains again, except this time it is data instead of people. It is the ports again, except this time it is signals instead of ships. The same habit shows up everywhere you look, once you know what you are looking for. For comparison, the United States has around 100,000 5G towers. China has 3 million. That is not really a technology gap because both countries had access to the exact same basic technology at roughly the same time. It is a gap in how fast a decision turns into something real. And that brings us all the way back to the question we asked at the very beginning of this video. Why does this keep happening over and over, in category after category? Part of it comes down to something simple. China has more than 1.4 billion people, which means when a huge project needs workers, engineers, and factories all at once, there are enough people to throw at the problem to make it move fast. But plenty of large countries have big populations too, and they do not build at this pace. So population is only part of the answer. Here is the real answer. It has almost nothing to do with invention and almost everything to do with speed and commitment. In a lot of countries, building something massive means years of meetings, studies, debates, and arguments before a single shovel ever touches the ground. In China, once a decision gets made, the money, the workers, and the factories all seem to move at the exact same time, toward the exact same goal, without waiting around for years of back and forth first. Think of it like the difference between one person cooking dinner alone in their kitchen, carefully measuring every ingredient and texting a friend to ask if it looks right, versus an entire restaurant kitchen packed with chefs, all working off the same order ticket at the same time. One version is careful and slow. The other version is loud, fast, and sometimes a little bit chaotic, but the food comes out unbelievably quick. Go back and think about everything you just heard. The 45,000 kilometers of train track, the 57-story tower built in 19 days, the 7 busiest ports on the planet. All of it followed the exact same playbook. Find an idea that already works somewhere else, decide it is worth doing at full scale, and then throw every possible resource at it until it is finished, instead of spending years debating whether it is worth starting in the first place. Or think about it like a relay race. Most countries build big things the way one runner tries to sprint an entire marathon alone, stopping every so often to check the map, catch their breath, and make sure they are still going the right way. China builds more like a relay team, where the government, the banks, the factories, and the workers all take off running at the exact same moment, passing the baton so fast it barely looks like a handoff at all. Same distance, same finish line, completely different pace. Now, it is worth saying this part too, because it is only fair. Moving this fast is not free. Building this much, this quickly, takes an enormous amount of borrowed money, and some Chinese cities have ended up with more empty apartment buildings than people to fill them. A few glass bridges and skyscrapers built purely for the record books get far fewer visitors than planned once the initial excitement fades. Not every fast build turns out perfectly, and speed like this always comes with a real cost, even when that cost does not show up until years later. But here is the thing that is actually true no matter what. China almost never invented the big idea first. The bullet train, the suspension bridge, the skyscraper, the solar panel, the electric car, nuclear power, none of it started in China. What China did was take other people's ideas and refuse to let them stay small. It took a good invention and asked a completely different question. Not, does this work, but how big, how fast, and how far can we possibly take this? Before you go. So there it is. China did not invent almost anything on this list, and yet somehow it ended up holding nearly every record anyway. Not because of magic, and not because of some secret trick, but because of sheer speed and sheer scale, applied over and over again until the copy grew bigger than the original ever did. If any part of this blew your mind even a little bit, Do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you catch the next one the second it drops. Now I want to know what you think. Out of everything we just talked about, the glass bridge, the 19-day skyscraper, the ship elevator at the Three Gorges Dam, which one would you actually want to stand on in real life? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this kind of story gets you hooked, go check out our next video, where we dig into the single biggest construction project happening on Earth right now. You will not believe how big it actually gets.